I should have taken care of this ahead of time, but there are some outlines. If you'd like an outline, Ethan and Denver, perhaps if y'all will raise your hand, they're back here on this back table if you want an outline. I don't know that it will benefit you, but you're welcome to it. It's actually a fill-in-the-blank outline. If you have your Bibles, please open them up to Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5. Let me say, first of all, thank you for this opportunity to get to be here. And also, let me give you a report on Eddie Kraft. Many of you have asked about him. Eddie Kraft was diagnosed with liver cancer, but it was a very successful situation. He had surgery. They removed that, and they don't anticipate that he'll need any post-operative treatments. He's home and doing great, and we're anxious to get him back at work at the school. Also, let me mention this. Out by the table, we have a couple of crates of free books. They're old books that they're duplicates that we do not need in our library. If you're interested in those, we would invite you to go look through the crates and also pick up some information about the school. We have some information there about our distance learning for Christian development. We have 2 classes coming up in October. We have a ladies' class on Tuesday night on the book of James, and we have a class for everyone on the book of John. These classes are from 7 to 9, and you can join us via Zoom, and there's information on there how to do that. Do I have a remote? I do have a remote. Is my PowerPoint loaded? Ah, that is beautiful. All right. The assigned topic is moving mountains through knowledge, and the assigned text is Matthew chapter 5, 1 through 12. There are mountains that are holding us back. There are mountains that are limiting the effectiveness of the Lord's church. Keith mentioned Brother Ira North just a moment ago, and it made me think of something else he said in one of his books. He only knew of 3 types of congregations: those that were in the midst of having problems, those that were about to have problems, or those that were going through problems. There are always problems. There are always challenges. And there are always mountains that we need to overcome. And so how do we move mountains? Well, we know that we need faith. That's true enough. And when we use our faith to move a mountain, how do we do it? And if you'll bear with me, I'm going to have a little object lesson this morning. You notice I took this out of my pocket, and there's a reason for that. You move a mountain 1 stone at a time. 1 stone at a time. And there's a reason why I took it out of my pocket. Because the biggest threat to the church, the biggest challenge to the church is not something out there. I want you to know this morning it's not something in here. It's something in here. Self is the biggest mountain that I have to overcome. And I suspect it's the biggest mountain that you have to overcome as well. Self keeps the church from being the church of Christ. And so, as we look at this mountainous problem, we need to understand that we've got to overcome this mountain. Now, when I'm a little bit nervous about a lesson, I'd like to tell you where we're going and what it's all about, and if I fail somehow, you'll still have that, okay? So the point of this lesson is the biggest mountains, the biggest challenges any child of God will face is self. And when we face the absence of a Christ-like disposition, we're a threat to the church. And the whole purpose of this lesson is to provide us with the tools to overcome those mountains. Now, as I say, overcome those mountains and providing those tools are found within this text. Now, the assigned text is Matthew 5, 1 through 12, but I want us to jump forward to verse 13 because beginning at verse 13, this is where we want to be. But you know, you don't just get there. There is a process that will lead us to the product. Verse number 13. You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? It is good for nothing but to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. You are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do they light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. I want to know how to be salt and how to be light. The idea of salt, I really believe here in this text, is the idea that it makes life more pleasant. You know, you add a little bit of salt to a meal, a little salt to beans or things like that. It just makes it more pleasant. Is your world more pleasant because you're there? And then the idea of light, where salt is not necessarily seen, but it has an influence, light can't be hidden. And light provides people with the illumination that they need to find their way. I want to be that kind of child of God. But it's not just a light switch that I flip on. It is a process. And involved with that process, we're going to see as we look in the text that there's also pain associated with that process. There's persecution involved with that process. Isn't it interesting, that word blessed? Some brethren say it means to be happy. I don't want to disagree with that necessarily, but I think that may be a little too surface. Because you see, I prefer to call it a joy. There's a joy that is not contingent upon circumstances. I know that's true because as you drop down to verse number 10, he says, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. And not only is it joy, but there is a blessing that's attached to this because we are approved by God. And God blesses us, and we have the joy that is associated with faithfulness. Well, what does that look like? Well, Matthew chapter 5, 13 through 16, that's the other side of the mountain. That's where I want to be. But the mountains are found in verses 3 through 12. We call these the Beatitudes. These are attitudes, if you would, that we are to be. These are attitudes that should characterize our life. So I want to just kind of walk down through the text. And if you'll pay close attention to the text as we walk through it, you'll have the sermon. It's one of the most profound sermons that we could ever lay our eyes on. The greatest sermon of all time, preached by the greatest preacher of all time. And I wish we had time just to talk about the sermon itself, because it is such a masterpiece in so many ways. I heard a preacher one time say, and before I even tell you what he said, I totally disagree with it. He said, Jesus just kind of reached down into his bag of potpourri and threw ideas out, and he had this idea and this idea. How foolish. It is the perfect sermon. It is laid out with such logic and such beautiful structure. And the Beatitudes serve as the most wonderful introduction. As a matter of fact, Franklin Camp thinks that the Beatitudes are the basis for the remainder of the book of Matthew. And of course, the Sermon on the Mount is an explanation of the Beatitudes. But as we look at these attitudes that are to characterize our life, if they really become part of us, then we're going to be dealing with the biggest mountain. We're going to be dealing with the biggest threat to our spirituality, to the church, and to the world, and that is self. So let's begin by looking at verse number 3. Jesus would say, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So if I want to be salt and I want to be light, I need to move the mountain of self-reliance. This is an interesting word, this word poor. It has to do with the idea of one who chooses to be poor. Throughout the Beatitudes, Jesus talks about physical realities applied to spiritual realities. In the physical realm, there are certain things that we don't necessarily admire. And he brings it over into the spiritual realm to help us understand we need to do something more than apply conventional wisdom to the way that we live. If we're going to be poor by choice, as a matter of fact, this particular word would be defined as one who is reduced to beggary. Isn't that interesting? When you see a beggar out on the road, you don't look at him and say, boy, I hope my children grow up to be like that. I met a beggar once down in Cologne, Panama. He was an interesting fella. He had been in prison in New York for many, many years, and then he was sent back to Panama. He spoke perfect English. He spoke perfect Spanish. He had no reason to be a beggar. Cologne is an area where there's all types of trade from all over the world. And he could have made a good living as a translator, but he didn't want to. He was content to live on a street corner and rely on the goodness and the graciousness of others. In the physical realm, we look at that and we think, why would you want to live like that? And unfortunately, many times people kind of take that attitude over into the spiritual realm and they say, I'm not dependent upon anybody. I'm smart enough, I'm tough enough, I can dig into God's Word, I can pull myself up by my own bootstraps. I know what I need to do. Of course, Jeremiah so strongly disagrees. Oh, Lord, I know the way of man is not in himself. It is not a man who walks to direct his own steps. Jeremiah 10, verse number 23. And here's the reality, and I hate to say this sometimes because people hear something else, and I hate to qualify it because I don't want to soften it, but here's the reality, folks. You're not smart enough to make it on your own. You're not tough enough to make it on your own. You're not good enough to make it on your own. If we could do it on our own, what's the point of the cross? Galatians chapter 2 and verse number 21 says, for if righteousness comes through the law, and though that phrase law is a little bit tough to grapple with, but in Galatians, it's not talking about the pure law of Moses. I know that's true because they had kind of taken the law of Moses and turned it into a hybrid sort of thing to fit their desires. And I think the idea there is if you turn it into a system of self-justification, if righteousness comes through what you can do, and incidentally, the law of Moses was never a pure system of self-justification. If righteousness comes through the law, then Christ died needlessly. If you're smart enough, spiritual enough, good enough, what's the cross all about? And so, the foundational principle, without God, I'm nothing. I need Him always. We sing the song sometimes, and listen, I'm sorry, I'm preaching to myself this morning, so I'm not trying, I don't know you all, but maybe it fits you too. We sing the song, I need Thee every hour, oh, I need Thee. And sometimes I chide myself and I say, why do you sing that song, but you don't live that song? Do we really understand how much we need Him? Christians, someone says, should we be extremely humble people or extremely confident people? And my answer is yes. We should be the most humble people among all, and we should be the most confident people among all simultaneously. That's John 15, verse 5. If you abide in me, you'll bear much fruit. I'm confident that with God, I can do whatever needs to be done. That's Philippians 4:13 as well, isn't it? I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. I can't fly around this building, but I don't need to fly around this building to be a faithful child of God, to be able to sow the seed. I don't need any of that. But I can accomplish what the Lord wants me to accomplish. I can be more kind. I can be more considerate. I can be more soul sensitive with God's help. If you abide in me, you'll bear much fruit. But what's the rest of the verse say? You know this. Without me, this is Jesus speaking, without me, you can do nothing. Let's be honest with you, there's those moments in my life when I forget that and I want to be a spiritual tycoon and I know so much and I'm confident. I don't want you to think I'm suggesting we go around beating ourselves up, but our confidence must always be tied to our relationship with Jesus Christ. Our confidence is always tied to a desire to be like Him, to abide in Him. And when we have an attitude of self-reliance, we will not be salt. We will not be light. It's very important that we be soul sensitive. But if we don't take care of this, we'll be like the Pharisees. Matthew 23, verse 15. He says, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, for you travel land and sea to win one proselyte. And when he is won, you make him twice as much the son of hell as yourself. That sobers me up. That sobers me up. There's a lot of things in my life I better not miss. But I better not miss the importance of absolute dependence upon God. Verse number 4, blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. We need to get rid of the attitude of indifference. And that can become a mountain in our own life that holds us back and keeps us from being what we're supposed to be. On radio, I believe it was 2 days ago, Wesley Simons told the story of a man he knew. The man was in his 80s. And the man told Wesley, he said, you know, I wish I could go back in time and change things. I wish today I could grieve over my sins. But I'll just be honest with you, they just don't bother me anymore. Now, isn't that amazing? A man knows, you know, this should bother me. This should bother me. But my heart has become hardened. What is it that grieves you? What is it that breaks your heart that you mourn over? David in Psalm 51, beautiful psalm about his brokenness and the reality that he had sinned. But listen to what David says, Psalm 51, verse 3, beginning, I acknowledge my transgression, and my sin is always before me. Someone says, don't look back, don't look back. I know. I know about Luke 9:62, any man having put his hand to the plow and looking back is not fit for service in the kingdom. I know about that. I know Lot's wife was told not to look back. And we dare not look back in those senses. We don't need to look back when we put our hand to the plow and say, I think I've made a mistake. Don't do that. We don't need to look back with a longing, a lifetime of sin behind us. We don't need to do that. But sometimes it helps to look back and realize, man, if not for the grace of God. You know, it's an amazing thing to me sometimes when I stop and think, and this, what I'm about to share is just for illustrative purposes. I know this sort of thing doesn't happen. But just for illustrative purpose, I imagine sometimes God is in heaven and He's looking down and there's an angel standing beside Him and they're having a conversation and God looks down to earth and He sees Bill Haywood and He says to the angel, there is my perfect servant, Bill Haywood. And the angel kind of chuckles and he says, God, I know you know everything, but don't you remember 1976? Do you remember what he did there? I mean, how he really blew. And do you remember 77, 78, 79, 80, 81, 82? I mean, Lord, do you remember? You remember that reprobate? And the God of heaven would turn to that angel and say, I don't remember any of that. I don't know about you. I remember my sins. I don't dwell on them, but I can't help it. But I used them to keep me sober and to realize where I could be and to appreciate the grace of God. I know we need to preach on grace. I know we need to preach on the love of God. We need to preach on the sacrifice of Jesus. But listen to me closely. If sin is not sinful, then grace is not gracious. And we need to feel that heavy burden of sin. And we need to be grateful for that grace and mercy and the blood of Jesus that covers every sin. And the fact that we serve a God, Hebrews 8 and verse 12, that says, under the new covenant, their sins and their lawless deeds I will remember no more. What about the sins of the world? Do they break our heart? I don't know much about what's going on in the world. I get about 5 minutes on the radio occasionally, maybe about once a week. I check the news, and maybe I should check it more. I don't know. I'm not sure I'm mature enough to handle it. But I know there's some weird things going on. I know that idolatry is rampant in our country. We think of idolatry as something that a bunch of primitive people would engage in. Idolatry at base is creating a God that's pleasing to you. In our country, choice has become God, has it not? And that was the mantra a few years ago. Abortion is a woman's choice. And we yawn. Before that, it was attend the church of your choice. And now it is gender. It's your choice. Does that grieve us? Or are we like one member that came to me, I'm telling you, absolutely, came to me one time, and I try not to get on hobbies. I really do. I try to preach the whole counsel of God, which means sometimes we're going to talk about the sin of heterosexual fornication, and sometimes we're going to talk about homosexuality. And I had a guy come up to me after a sermon where we talked about homosexuality, and he said, look, man, I am gayed out. I just don't want to hear about it anymore. Just let it be. You know, there's a lot of things I feel that way. I don't want to hear about it anymore. Does it grieve us? And I'm not talking about just going into the corner, oh, this bothers me so bad. Does it grieve us to the point that we're motivated to carry the gospel to a lost and dying world? Because I tell you, that's what our world needs. I don't know how many are in this room at this moment, but I want you to know, I believe this with all my heart, soul, and mind. I believe it is the overwhelming declaration of the New Testament that in this room, there's more power assembled to effect change in our country and in our world in this room than there are in both houses of Congress, the Supreme Court, and in the White House. I've got opinions about who should be in the White House, but let me tell you something. There's a problem. There's a problem if we're hanging everything on the next election. The answer is the gospel, because the problem is sin, and it needs to break our heart. There's so many things we could talk about. Divorce for any cause. We could talk about beverage alcohol. We could talk about the casino. I don't know whether you have casino gambling in Kentucky. We've got it over in Virginia. It was just introduced a couple of years ago. And we fought against it. People laughed at us. You know, there's a lot of information out there about regional casinos. We know what's going to happen because they've been out there for a while. And we told them some of the things that were going to be happening. The Lord's people led the charge. And sure enough, this last week, a woman was arrested for locking her 3-year-old child in the car while she went in the casino to gamble. I hope that bothers you, but I hope it makes you grieve. And I hope it makes you realize that woman and people like her need the gospel. Our mourning should motivate us to move forward. All right, Verse 5, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. It is only the meek that are going to enjoy all the blessings that this life has to offer. I don't mean to be silly when I say this, but when the atheist stands on a beautiful mountaintop and, Zach made mention of these beautiful mountains, that when we moved from Russell County, Virginia to Elizabeth, and my wife said the only requirement is I've got to be able to see the mountains. We love the mountains. And when an atheist beholds the beautiful mountains or a beautiful sunset, who do they think? It's the Christian that realizes all the benefits and all the blessings of being in God's creation. We're the ones that are able to really enjoy life. But who is it? It is the meek. Moses was referred to as more humble, more meek than all men on the face of the earth. Jesus would say in Matthew chapter 11 and verse number 28, come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle or meek and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. Unfortunately, when we think about meek, we might think about someone who's kind of downcast and sad and soft-spoken. And sometimes that may fit. But sometimes we may need to be like Jesus in John chapter 2, beginning around verse 14, when he entered the temple and he saw, I think we missed a big message of what is happening in the temple when he drives the people out. He saw people being used. He saw religion being used. He saw people being extorted. And his meekness demanded that he do something. You're not going to do this. Now that's amazing to me, absolutely amazing, because you see, I wish I had that ability. I would love it if Christianity, if every reaction was a one-size-fits-all. The extremes, man, that's a wonderful place to live in this respect. If you're living in an extreme, it's easy. You don't have to think. I'm going to be ultra-liberal. Don't even have to think. I'm going to be ultra-conservative. You don't even have to think. That's not the way life is. There are times when you need to get angry with a holy indignation and say, no, that is wrong. And then there are times when you take a lot. And you may even feel like you're a bit of a doormat. But you know that that's what's best in this situation. And maybe there's an immature Christian that needs to grow and mature, and you can help them along the way. Well, tell me when those times are, Bill. Here's all I know to tell you. You need to get to know Jesus really well. I mean, really, really well. And I'm not being trite when I say that. Because there are times when you need to hold your tongue. And like Jesus, not literally, at least for most of us, it won't be literally. You'll be spat upon and you'll be beaten, and you hold your tongue because that's the best for that moment. You see, that's really meekness, is strength under control. I had a friend that I studied with in Abingdon, Virginia. He grew up Amish, and he left the Amish faith, and he became a oneness Pentecostal, and we studied together quite a bit, and we became good friends. He never obeyed the gospel, and from time to time we still talk. But I would go out to his farm, quite an interesting thing. You'd had to walk across a swinging bridge across a river to get to his property, and he still farmed, even though he wasn't Amish. He still farmed in kind of a primitive way with horses and plows pulled behind horses and things of that nature. And so one day we were studying. He says, I'm about to go work out in the field. Would you like to come with me? I said, sure. And so we went out to the barn. He had 2 horses that we would consider be normal-sized horses. And then he had 2 horses that were Belgium horses. He would put the 2 Belgium horses in the middle and the 2 other horses on the outside. And the Belgium horses, I've never been around a Clydesdale, but that's what I would imagine a Belgium horse would be like. I mean, it truly, his back was above my head. It was huge. It was so muscular. Now, my little friend, he was a little friend. He was not very tall. He was very small structure. And he would get between those horses and between the horse and the barn wall. If that horse stepped on you, you would be obligated to be hurt. I mean, they were monsters. But my little frail friend He could go in there and make a little sound, and that horse would just do whatever the master commanded. The horse didn't lose its strength, but the horse was under the control of the master. And this is the idea of meekness. Who is in control? Now, I've already failed. Part of my illustration, I was going to remove some of these mountains that are within my heart, and arrogance has got to go if I hope to be the person that God needs me to be. All right, verse number 6. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled. Some of you in the room will remember when Mick Jagger would scream across the stage, "I can't get no satisfaction." I shared that with my mother one time. I was talking about preaching a sermon. I was going to use that. She said, "That's not grammatically correct." I said, "I know that, Mom, but he said it." "Who said it?" I said, "Mick Jagger said it." "Well, he's a poor example to use in a sermon." And he is. And when that becomes our mantra, we are poor examples of what a Christian should be. And so we need to reach into our heart and remove the disposition, the mountain of spiritual anorexia. You remember over in Luke chapter 15, the prodigal, he left home. He wasted his father's money on riotous living. And then he found himself all alone. He attached himself to someone in that country. And he found himself feeding swine. Terrible job for a good little Jewish boy. And as he was feeding those swine, he was so hungry that he longed for the pig slop. Now, what's my point? I'm using this illustrative. This is not necessarily what the text teaches, but this is true. If you don't feed on a good, nutritious diet, you'll crave any garbage you can get. Isn't it amazing? Don't raise your hand. You can nod if you want to. How many of you in this room, if you think back 40 years ago, how many of you ever thought you'd pay for television? Not only do we pay for television, we pay big money for television. And we have all this. It's like an electronic sewer line flowing through the air, and in living color, this just dumps all this sewage into our house, and we whoo-hoo-hoo-hoo. And well, we don't do that anymore. Now we do that, right? What do you feed on? So much you got to get into God's Word. That's true. But the biggest aim of your life, you've got to make up your mind. I want to do what's right. I want to be characterized by what is right. I want every moment of my life, I want to be asking the question, okay, what's right? What's most pleasing to God? You know, that has become a major question for me. Keith, I've had it up to here with brethren that come up with the question, whatever the blank is, you really think that would send someone to hell? That is a dumb question. You really think one beer would send a person to hell? That is a dumb question. And that's a euphemism for something much stronger. Someone said, you really think using an instrument in worship would send someone to hell? That is a dumb question. Well, why is it a dumb question, Bill? Because here's the question. What is most pleasing to God? And you can deal with the hypotheticals all day long, but you know what that tells me? Why do you want to get up close to the line? And I'm not saying that using an instrument is close to the line. You cross the line. But there is a problem. There's a heart problem if you're saying, well, let me see. Really? I don't think one beer, that's not going to hurt. Really? If we have the attitude, I'm just craving what's right. I've got to say this. Most powerful argument against beverage alcohol. 1 Peter 2:5, 1 Peter 2:9, we are priests. We're a royal priesthood. Is that right? How do we know anything about priests? Where do we find priesthood principles? You cannot find priesthood principles in the New Testament alone. You can't do it. You got to go back to the Old Testament. When you go back to the Old Testament, Leviticus 10, what's one of the requirements of a priest? When you're officiating, you cannot partake of any intoxicating beverage so that you'll know the difference between the holy and the profane. When do we officiate before the Lord? When? Now, that's for free. Now back to the lesson. What is it that you really crave in your life? 1 Peter chapter 2, beginning at verse 1. Therefore, laying aside all malice, all deceit, all hypocrisy, envy, and all evil speaking. Now get this, as newborn babes desire the pure milk of the word. That's interesting right there, that word pure, logikos. We get our word reasonable from that. There are people that really struggle with that. They say, it doesn't fit. Yeah, it does. Yeah, it does. Do you crave that which is logical and rational? And unfortunately, I love Star Trek, but we get this idea of Mr. Spock, logic's just cold and no feeling and very clinical and everything. No, when you look at God's Word and you see how well it fits together and how much sense it makes, it's thrilling. Is that what you desire? Is that the number one thing in your life? All right, let's move on. Verse number 7, blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. If I want to be salt and light, I need to reach into my heart and I need to remove the mountain of heavy-handedness. How do we deal with people? How do we deal with difficult people? How do we deal with our spouse, with our employer, our employees? And I just know from experience, at the workplace, you might be dealing with a jerk. You're kidding me. You gave me extra time. Okay, we'll try to wrap this up. That was not intentional, Zach, for me to say jerk, and then you hold up that 10-minute sign. But I do confess the thought crossed my mind. You work with a jerk. He doesn't seem like he cares about your feelings. Seems like all he wants to do is step on your feelings. It's like sometimes I've been around people, and you have too, unfortunately, even in the church. If you would use the analogy that you're wearing, your oxygen mask, you're in an atmosphere where you don't have any oxygen, and so you have your oxygen mask on, and they think it's cute to come up and kink your oxygen holes. I think there are people like that they think that's cool, and they think they've actually accomplished something by getting a reaction out of you. And you're just like, please, let me breathe. And you don't want to show any mercy. It's tough. And over the years, I've had to tell myself, you will not die. You will not die. And so someone's kinked your hose. Am I going to show mercy? Mercy is what we want extended to us, and we need to extend it to others. 2 examples back in the book of 1 Samuel 24, you remember? Saul is pursuing David as if he were the worst possible criminal on the face of the earth. How amazing, because David was the greatest supporter of King Saul. Up to that point in his life, David was so good, you can't hardly imagine it. Now later on, things changed. But up to that point, he was so good. And King Saul is just so irrational. And King Saul is pursuing him, and he wanders into a cave to relieve himself, and David and his men are hiding back there. And it's David's opportunity to end it all. But instead, he just cuts off part of Saul's skirt, trying to indicate to Saul, I could have ended your life. Back off. And then he has guilty feelings about doing that. He said, this is God's anointed. Later on, he sneaks into the camp, but he will not take Saul's life, and he will not allow anyone else to take Saul's life. There are a lot of things within your power. Mercy says, I'm not going to do everything I can. I'm going to do everything the other person needs me to do. That is an amazing thing. Well, let's move on to verse number 8. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. I need to reach down and pull out that mountain of contamination out of my heart. All types of problems, Romans chapter 12, verse number 1 and 2. Paul would say, I beg you, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies as living sacrifices, holy, acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. It's rational. That's that other time that word's used, logikos. Sounds like logical, doesn't it? That's what service to God is. It's logical. But we've got to give our lives to Him. In the very next verse, he says, and be not conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Don't let the world squeeze you into its mold. You decide that you're going to be God's man or God's woman. 1 John chapter 2, verse 15, do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. James 4 and verse 4, adulterers and adulteresses. Do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Why is it this inclination? You can go all the way back to 1 Samuel 8. We want to be like the nations around us. Everybody else is doing it. Well, look at what the church down the road's doing. There's another one of those have it up to here deals. When somebody comes and they say, you know, down there at Highlands Fellowship, look how many people, they must be doing something right. Well, you know, we could bring in beer and go-go dancers and fill the building. You know, don't tell me that. Why do we want to be like the world around us? We need to get rid of the contamination. If we really want to be salt and light, we got to purify our lives. All right, last point. Zach, I'm hurrying. Verse 9, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of God. I need to get rid of that agitation in my life. And if I want to be salt and light, it's got to be gone. And I really think the greater emphasis here is making peace with God. Romans chapter 5, verse 1, therefore, having been justified by faith, we have peace with God. And it's not just the absence of hostility, but it is the enjoyment of a relationship with God. Over in the Middle East, if they quit shooting off firecrackers for, 5 minutes, someone says, oh, we got peace. And if there was a political way to achieve peace over there, and they quit killing each other, we'd think, man, they got peace. No, they don't, because they still would hate each other in their hearts. Peace with God is a relationship where He enjoys the relationship with us and we enjoy the relationship with Him. And if that be true, then it should be carried out in our human relationships. And the reality is, most congregations, this is just my experience, nothing scientific, but I believe it is what the Bible teaches and it's what's true. Most congregations, if they can just have a little bit of peace, just a little bit of peace, they'll do fine. Now, I'm not saying the other stuff's not important, but when self gets in the way, I got a call from one of our graduates last night, and the congregation is being torn asunder because one member wants their way. I have a rule at Tri-City School of Preaching with all the faculty and all the students. Everyone's entitled to have their say, but no one's entitled to have their way. We need to understand in the Lord's church, we don't need a Diotrephes. We don't need any church bosses. We need humble servants of Jesus Christ. Okay, before I run out of time, then verse 10, blessed are the persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. We need to get rid of this problem where we just always avoid conflict at all cost. Listen, I don't like conflict. But if conflict avoidance becomes primary to us, we got a problem. Oh, don't say that, you're going to hurt somebody's feelings. Look, there's tactful ways to say things, and then there's ways to say things that are not polite. But the reality is, Now listen to me closely. I may not say this well, so listen to me closely. When I was preaching in Abingdon, Virginia, I felt this way. When I'm now a member at Stony Creek and directing the School of Preaching at Tri-Cities, I feel this way, and I believe it's biblical. I would prefer people in the community to hate the Church of Christ because of who we are than to not even know who we are. Too many times there's people around us that I don't know who we are. I've gone into towns. Some of you preachers probably have done this too. I've had speaking assignments. I've never been there. Before the days of GPS, I'd pull into a town. I couldn't find it. I'd go into a service station. Do you know where the Church of Christ is? Hey, Frank, do you know where the Church of Christ is? We don't have a Church of Christ in this town. Go to another service station, same thing. And the people in your community, they're nuts. They don't use instruments. They think you have to be baptized to be saved. I would rather them know that stuff. Yes, I want them to know we care. Yes, I want them to know we love them. But at least let's get the word out there. But it's going to make people angry. Let's do it in the most loving, kind way that we can, but let's do it. All right. I got about 15 seconds. But it's going to take longer than that. Let me give you the challenge. As we look at these Beatitudes, it's really a portrait. It's a portrait of the kingdom child. It is a portrait of what someone looks like when they are salt and light. But it's really a portrait of Jesus. And so I'm going to give you the challenge, and then I'm going to give you an illustration. So the challenge for each one of us here in this room today, if we want to remove the mountains that are keeping the church from being effective, which is self, we need to really get to know Jesus. And I know that sounds trite, that sounds cliche, but it's really not. You know, there have been a lot of great impersonators over the years. From my day, I remember Rich Little. How many of y'all remember Rich Little? Man, I mean, that guy was phenomenal. He could imitate people like John Wayne or Kirk Douglas or Richard Nixon. He would look like them, talk like them, act like them. Just absolutely amazing. If Rich Little was here today in his prime, I could call him up here and say, Rich, I have an assignment for you. I want you to imitate this particular person. He said, sure. Who is it? I want you to imitate Wayne Sparks. He says, I don't know Wayne Sparks. Well, now listen. Wayne Sparks means the world to me. Wayne Sparks was my uncle. So please just imitate Wayne Sparks. He says, I don't know anything about Wayne Sparks. Just go ahead and do it. He means the world to me. He means so much to me. It was my uncle, and he was so wonderful and so great. Please just imitate him. And you already get the point. You cannot imitate someone you do not know. If we're going to move the mountains of selfishness, of envy, of conceit, of arrogance, of spiritual anorexia, of self-reliance, we've got to get to know Jesus. The challenge for you and the challenge for me, let's get to know Jesus. Let's act like Jesus. Let's react like Jesus. Thank you.